triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Just prior to today's passage was Jesus' parable of the tenants, which exposed the neglect of Israel's leaders to their covenantal responsibilities. By contrast, in today's parable, Jesus is throwing a wider net of indictment, for in it, he exposes the contempt which Israel as a whole had towards God's covenantal grace. But even though this parable is specifically about Israel, certainly it has words for us to heed, because the sin that is found in Israel's heart is too often in our heart as well. Finally, before looking at today's parable, I want to remind you that the primary purpose of parables is not to make spiritual realities more attainable and relatable. And yet they do uncover aspects of reality not typically seen. About parables, Jesus once said that they would cause some to be ever hearing and ever seeing, but never perceiving. Ultimately, parables are invitations to draw near Christ and through him receive understanding. With respect to a parable's capacity to uncover aspects of reality not typically seen, some of them are more transparent than others. I think today's parable is quite transparent, so much so that I am tempted to say that it's almost a straight, non-analogical expression of the nature of reality. In other words, there is a king, there is a banquet, we all are invited to this banquet, and the question is, will we respond to the invitation and prepare ourselves to come? That is the nature of reality. So let's look at our passage today. As I just communicated, there is a king and there is an invitation to attend this banquet. But before there was an invitation that was sent to all of us, there was first an invitation to the household of God, the Israelites. The Jews of Jesus' audience would have understood that Jesus was talking about the best messianic banquet at the end of the age. And they would have understood themselves to be the invited guests. They were the children of Abraham. They were the ones that Moses established the covenant at Mount Sinai. They were the ones that had the promises and the prophets. So what would have been surprising in this parable is the refusal of the guests to come, particularly in that generation. Yes, Israel had been exiled before. Yes, the judgment of God had come upon Israel, but that season was over. They were now back in the promised land. Yes, there was a problem. They were living under the rule of the Roman overlords. But that was the problem, not their disobedience in their minds, because they wanted to stay in the promised land. So in this parable, to hear Jesus say that they refused to come to the wedding feast, I imagine that would have been a surprise to many. In verse 4, we see that though the guests refuse the invitation, the king doubles down and offers the invitation by trying to persuade the invited guests again with a portrait of a spectacular and sumptuous feast. And still they refused. In a shame-honor society such as this, the king would be displaying great forbearance and humility in offering this second invitation to the invited guests. For many in Jesus' audience, this would have likely invoked the history of Israel's covenantal unfaithfulness and the host of prophets and leaders that God raised up to exhort Israel to keep the covenant and remind them of God's covenant faithfulness to Israel. Moving on, looking at verses 5 through 7, I want you to note that the guests didn't even have the courtesy to offer a formal no. Instead, the text says they paid no attention and went off, one to his field and another to his business. And then to add injury to insult, the passage states the rest seized his servants, mistreated, and killed them. And what is the king's response? He was enraged and sent an army to kill those murderers and burn their city down. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this seems like a bit of an incommensurable overreaction to refuse an invitation to a party. But I would like to first point out that the text refers to some of those who refused to come as murderers. The rest, we might say, merely dishonored the king by ignoring his invitation, which seems like a minor offense. And if the king was a generous man, a great man, a man of true greatness and largesse of spirit, wouldn't he be able to overlook this offense and just forgive them? But we must understand something about the honor of the king, about the honor of kings, and the nature of shame-honor society in the ancient world to understand the dynamics of this text. In ancient societies, particularly, as I just said, in shame-honor cultures, a king's honor was related to the proper ordering of society and its flourishing. The laws of society was in some manner rooted in a king's will, and the king often functioned as a priest who mediated between the divine and the rest of the people in his kingdom, particularly to procure blessings for his people. In this context, to dishonor a king was to undermine the very fabric of culture by which all things were held together and by which blessing came upon the people. All that I say here about a king in ancient society could likewise be applied to God. But one thing that is true about God that cannot necessarily be said about earthly kings is that God's honor is not an egoistic affair. If you slight God's honor, it's not like he's sitting on his throne going, "You, sir, have offended me. Duels at dawn," right? God is just, good, and holy. And honor and glory is the foundation of the realities of all that we live in. For God to uphold his honor is in many ways equal to him upholding our flourishing, true fulfillment, and our dignity. For God to take action against those who undermine his honor is not him redressing a personal offense in the way that we typically understand that as egoistic creatures ourselves. That would be a projection upon God to view it that way. That would be a projection of our small egoistic hearts on the motives of God when he reacts in this manner, and he is not like that. Rather, because his very being is identified with what is true, good, and beautiful, and conversely, what is true, good, and beautiful is to be identified with God's very being. For God to seek his honor and to redress offenses against his honor is for him to seek the good of all creation, and particularly the good of all those creatures made in his image. In this context, the failure of the people to respond to the king's invitation goes beyond a mere slight and instead expresses an evil that undermines the goodness of all creation and all creatures. And in this light, the judgment that the king expressed, particularly after such a forbearance, is his right reaction to restore the goodness of the fallen order. Turning to verses 8 through 10, Paul makes clear in Romans 11 that Israel's rejection of the Messiah meant that God's blessing would come to the world. And this is precisely what we see in this narrative turn in the parable. The king tells his servants to go out in the streets because those who were originally invited deemed themselves unworthy to attend the banquet, to come into the kingdom by their refusal of his invitation. And so the servants went out into the street corners for anyone and for everyone. And this has the connotation of the peoples from all the nations now being invited to the wedding supper of the king's son. But just when you think this parable might come to a conclusion, he's merely announcing to the Israelites that I am opening up my kingdom to the Gentiles. By the way, this was foretold in the prophets if you were paying attention. The story is not yet over. You will note that in gathering all the people, the text state that those gathered were characterized as both good and bad, which establishes the context for the confrontation, that we see in the following verses. The king looks out among the guests and spots a man without wedding clothes, which after a confrontation resulted in the man being removed from the banquet and being tossed into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, biblical scholars argue about whether it was a custom at this time for hosts to offer guests wedding clothes in Jewish society. As I was reading around, I saw sermon after sermon and commentary after commentary basically making this point, that that was the custom at that time. But apparently recent scholarship raises questions about this. Was that indeed a custom among the Jews at the time of Jesus? If this was the case, then we have a nice connection to the idea of God offering, metaphorically, the clothing of Christ and his righteousness as a means for being present at the banquet. And I like this idea. So I continue to read. As I read around, it seemed to be the common conclusion among many of the early church fathers that indeed that was the nature of this garment. That the garment of the wedding feast is to be understood as the righteousness of Christ that is given to us. And honestly, if I'm going to have to choose between the early church fathers and modern scholars, and there are reasons to listen to the modern scholars, I'm not utterly dismissive of them, but I am of a tradition that respects tradition and the word of the fathers. And they were close to the time of Christ and the social dynamics of that culture. And I think they had understanding often that we don't have, no matter how much historical research we might do in the modern world. And so I believe there is something of the righteousness of Christ that is being conferred upon us through these wedding garments. But I want to point out that they, the church fathers, though they equated putting on such a garment with baptism, would not have viewed the covering of Christ as a mere forensic declaration. Yes, the covering of Christ doesn't entail a new status that we have before God, but it is more than that. More importantly, it is the means by which grace is given to bear fruit in our lives unto Christ likeness, which is the full covering of Christ. And so it raises questions about the nature of this person who was at the wedding feast. He had responded to the invitation, but had grace really taken a hold of him? Had it really begun to transform him? Had it really begun to make him one that was worthy to be there? Yes, we must stand on the foundation of Christ, but that grace must work its way into our souls. He responded to the invitation, but he did not honor the king by wearing the clothes proper to the occasion. Clothes that, when properly worn, not only confer honor, but make one honorable. This is how the church fathers again and again would see this. Continue in the grace that you were given. Continue in the grace that you were given in your baptism. And now we have these concluding words. Many are invited, but few are chosen. And about this, I want to say that it would be wrong to read into this final verse a full-blown Calvinist understanding of election. And yet, it is not devoid of God's sovereignty. Hear these words from a biblical scholar. Jesus concludes with a pithy statement explaining the parable. Many are invited, but some refuse to come, and others who do come refuse to submit to the norms of the kingdom and are therefore rejected. Those who remain are called chosen, a word implicitly denying that the reversals in the parable in any way catch God unaware or remove sovereign grace from his control. At the same time, it is clear from all three parables, and so we're talking about the parable of the two sons, the parable of the tenants, and this parable, the wedding banquet. It is clear from all three parables that not the beginning, but the end is crucial. If you have responded to the Lord, God bless you. Continue to respond to the Lord until you draw your last breath. That is what matters. And so, brothers and sisters, because the end is what matters most, I ask you, where are you in response to the King's invitation? We are, after all, living in the age of the invitation. The kingdom has been inaugurated, but it is not yet complete. So the banquet has not yet happened. But in the power and the creativity and the miracle nature of God, we have a foretaste of the banquet here at this table to nourish us and encourage us and strengthen us to continue on this journey of responding again and again to this invitation. Are you continuing to adore yourself with the clothing of the King so as to obtain and reflect the honor of his Son in your life? Stated another way, as I stated it at the beginning, there is a king and there is a banquet, and we all are invited to this banquet. And the question is, will you respond to the invitation and prepare yourself to come? Now, I really want to get to the good news, because I know I've given you an exhortation and a bit of a challenge. I'm not the kind of person that likes to hear these kind of exhortations. Persevere into the end if you finally want to be saved. I always feel like that kind of person that doesn't really have perseverance in and of myself. I will start a marathon, and around mile 2, I'll go, whew, that was enough. I'm tired. I think I'll sit down over here. I could do a sprint. Marathons are hard. So all we've heard about God's honor in this parable had to do with judgment and rejection. People failing to acknowledge and heed God's honor were rejected and casted out. But I also want to say that God's honor is not only the foundation of the order of the universe and all blessing and all goodness in all creation, it is also the impetus of redemption. As I was reading around for this sermon, I came across this website that was from a group of missionaries that were talking about shame and honor culture and how to reach out, particularly to Muslim societies. And in all that they said, I extracted 4 things that I want to share with you. I think it helps illumine the passage we just read, and I think it helps us understand the nature of the struggle that we are in this age between the age of invitation. In shame honor cultures, family and social connections define everything. It's not your education. It's not what you do by the works of your hand. It's not by what you have earned. It's family and social connections. Honor is a shared commodity. What one person does brings honor or shame upon the family and potentially an entire community. In Adam, we have all been shamed. And each of us in our own way have continued to exacerbate that shame and increase it, both for the lives of those around us and for our own lives as well. But in the second Adam, Jesus Christ, honor has come into the world, and he confers that honor upon us. And as long as we turn to him, even if we fail, we get up and we turn to him, he will continue to confer that honor upon us. In a shame honor culture, social capital fixes anything and everything. Since problems are solved via relationships, the right relationships are essential for success in life and for facing problems and overcoming challenges. It's not what you have, but who you know. Who do you know? Jesus Christ, the righteous one, the one who has overcome, the one who brings honor to our shame and righteousness to our guilt. It's not what you have, but who you know. In a shame honor culture, aggressive acts and redemptive violence can restore honor. That's one of the things that's shocking to us in the West when we read about events that happen, particularly in the Middle East, right? We've heard of these things before, honor killings. Now, it's very easy for us, for those of us in the West who are outside of that social framework, who tend to look at people as individuals who are merely responsible for themselves, to understand the pressure that is on families and people within that culture to redress wrongs because of how they have been shamed, are now living under the pall of shame. How could they possibly be tempted to harm someone that's close to them? But we don't live in that culture. I'm not saying that cultural values are relative. I'm trying to say we don't understand the pressure that those people are under. But one of the things I think is present in those kind of cultures, not readily available to us, is on the converse side. In that culture, when someone confers honor upon you, that really constitutes who you are. And I know that many of you wrestle with, yeah, I get that I have the righteousness of Christ. I've called upon the name of the Lord. I get that I stand before God in the righteousness of Christ. But in your own way, you probably think, but if you scratch beneath the surface, Anthony, you would see a whole lot of mess on the inside. And I feel far removed from that righteousness. I don't feel like a true son of God. And I think in part we wrestle in that way because that's the consciousness of the West and the rabid and rapid individualism that overtakes us all. But in that culture, I think they got a sense of having who you are constituted by another, having who you are given to you by another, by what they confer upon you. So when they hear the good news that Jesus gives you the status of sonship, that Jesus gives you honor, that gets a hold of your heart. And you could imagine why then the apostles, who were people of that culture, were so passionate about Jesus to take the gospel to the world, because they understood their status as sons of God. But as I said, in that culture, aggression and redemptive acts of violence restore honor. But in God's economy, he himself submits to the aggression, to the violence. He himself sheds his blood to restore our honor instead of exacting our blood for the sake of his honor. Finally, food conveys honor. Isn't that amazing? Food conveys honor. Table fellowship conveys honor. What do we do week after week? We come to this table. This is not just a symbolic act. And if you're good Anglicans, you already accept that. You believe in the real presence, that somehow Christ is truly present and available to us and communicating his very life, his flesh and his blood to us through the bread and the wine. But with that life comes true honor. With the bread and the wine comes a conference upon you to constitute you again and again as his son. Whether you are a man and a woman, you are an inheritor of the kingdom of God. So I want to conclude with this statement from the Lawson movement. I believe that was founded by Billy Graham, another mission agency. By the way, mission agencies do good theology. They have to deal with, cultural translation and so forth. And so they really have to kind of tease out what is essential to the gospel and think about how to unpack the gospel in new contexts and creative ways. So listen to this. God desires to bless the nations with honor and share his name with his people. The restoration of status which all people long for plays a key role in God's mission throughout history. God called Abraham to a life of honor, a large family, a great name, blessings and divine protection from dishonor. These covenantal promises extended to Israel. A nation of despised slaves became God's treasured possession, set in praise, fame, and honor, high above all other nations. a people of slaves set above all other nations. God's people are chosen to mediate God's honor to all nations. God's Son left the glory of heaven to bring God's saving honor to all people. Jesus testified to God's true honor by breaking bread with outsiders, healing outcasts, and shaming shamers on the cross. On the cross, a symbol of grand ignominy, he bore our shame and restored our honor. Now, anyone who believes in Jesus will never be put to shame, because Jesus shares his glory with his people. And so I say, prepare for that wedding feast by continuing to look to him. When you fall into shame, call upon the name of the Lord. Call upon the name of the Lord. Make your confession, and he will cover you. And this is the good news.